Hello and welcome again to Microeconomics. Today we're going to talk about a couple of different topics which really in a way you could say we're going to relax some of the assumptions that we've been making. First up, we're going to talk a little bit about firms and why firms exist, and second we're going to talk a little bit about information. Kind of setting the stage for that, one of the assumptions, which is not a terribly obvious assumption that we've been making all along, is the whole idea that everyone that everyone involved in a market has complete and total information of what's going on. It's really not obvious, but way back when we were talking about supply and demand, we kind of assumed that all of the buyers knew what all the other buyers were doing and what all of the suppliers were doing. We assumed that all the suppliers knew what everyone else was charging, as an example, that all the buyers knew what everybody else was paying for a particular good or service. As you well know from buying things yourself, that's not always the case. You don't always have perfect information. You're not always completely and totally clear on what other people are paying. And we all have this sinking feeling from time to time in which we suddenly realize, I might have paid too much for that. And that's a case in which the information is less than perfect. Same thing is true when we think about firms. And so we're going to start off by thinking for a minute, what is the rationale? What is the reason why firms exist to begin with? Surprisingly, economists have been around for 300 years before they ever actually thought about that, because it was so obvious that they were efficient. And so along the way, an economist named Coase decided to ask that question, which ultimately ended up winning him a Nobel Prize. So let's talk for a second about what is the rationale, what's the reason behind having a firm, and under what conditions is that maybe not the best way to do that. One way of thinking of that is to think in terms of, suppose you wanted to build a house, it would be entirely possible for you to do it all yourself, especially in a world in which you have perfect information. If you knew exactly how to build a house and you had all of the necessary information on exactly how to construct a house, then you could do it yourself. You wouldn't really need to hire someone else to do it. But why is it that even in that kind of situation, and we do know that people who are in the construction business don't typically build their own house. They hire people to do parts of it. So why is it that they do that? Well, there are at least three good reasons for that. First thing off, firms minimize transaction cost. Even if you know how to build the house yourself, the idea of going around and figuring out the best possible price on lumber and the best possible price on nails and the best possible price on bricks and so forth would incur a fairly substantial cost. You'd have to do an awful lot of shopping around. And so firms are in a position to be constantly shopping and thus decrease transaction cost and find resources at the lowest possible price. They also minimize production cost because they're in a position to know what are the best possible production techniques, what are the people who are capable of doing that. They know all the painters and the best carpenters and the best bricklayers and so forth, and so they can minimize production costs. Gist of which is they are typically more efficient. They're capable of producing your house for you at a lower cost than what you could do for yourself because they can minimize all of the cost associated with it. Now, that might lead you to think, well, why wouldn't a firm just do everything? If you're going to build a house anyway, why wouldn't you also be the firm that would produce the lumber and ultimately would sell the house and so forth? And that is a question of vertical integration. Vertical integration occurs when you expand into either an earlier or a later stage of production. So if you're a general contractor for housing, then if you also get into the lumber business or the building supply business, then you're vertically integrating. Or if you're a builder and you decide that you're going to market your own homes, that you're going to provide your own real estate agent services, then you're vertically integrated. Why would you not vertically integrate? Well, the ultimate boundary on that is known as bounded rationality. There's only so much that you're capable of handling efficiently. You may be the best builder in all the world, but you probably don't know an awful lot about how to market a house, or how to get it listed properly, or have the time to visit with all of the potential buyers and that sort of thing. And that's known as bounded rationality. It is, however, the case that sometimes, as well as that, you're not at the minimum efficient scale. That is, you're not at a position where doing it yourself would be an efficient way of doing it. And we've actually encountered this before. That is a case in which as you produce more and more of a good or a service, it actually costs less per unit. And in many cases, it's not worth your while to do it. So if you're a builder and you produce one house per year, it's really not efficient for you to also be your own real estate agent. As far as that goes, if you're a builder and you produce a couple of houses per year, it's not worth your while to run your own building supply outfit, because you're not going to save enough money and you're not going to be at the minimum efficient scale. It also is a boundary that it's possible you can't observe the quality of the things that you're moving into, and that there are actually many suppliers, and it's not necessary for you to vertically integrate. Now, reminder about the minimum efficient scale question. Here we've got a case in which a computer manufacturer is making 1 million computers per year, and they're considering purchasing making their own chips rather than purchasing them. And notice that what happens when we look at chip manufacture is we don't exhaust all the economies of scale until we get to 5 million per year. So you, as a computer manufacturer, would have higher cost per chip if you produced your own, because you can produce 5 million per year at a lot less than what you can 1 million per year. And so in this case, you as the computer manufacturer, it doesn't make sense for you to vertically integrate and produce your own chips, because it would be too expensive to do so and would drive your prices up. So why would you purchase your inputs? Well, because that allows you to specialize, and it allows you to use your comparative advantage. And here you can think of several different companies where they're computer manufacturers only. They don't build the components, they simply put the components together. Why so? Because it allows them to do what they do best. Their comparative advantage is in the marketing, the design of the computers, rather than the manufacture of the chip. Firms will buy components, that is, not produce them, if buying is cheaper than making it. And if you have a component, a piece or a part that's well defined and its quality is easily observable. And that would be the case with a chip. You can test the chip and find out whether it's the right quality or not. You can define what parameters it needs to have built into it and test to see if it does. And if that's the case, then it doesn't make sense for you to make it. It makes more sense for you to purchase it from somebody else. And that especially would be the case if there are lots of suppliers of the component that you need. And there are some parts in the computer industry that fall into that category. This leads us to the whole idea of outsourcing. And outsourcing simply means that the firm buys the product or services from outside suppliers, which allows them to concentrate on their core competency and utilize the law of comparative advantage. Now, that has a benefit in that firms can supply what other firms no longer do for themselves. It lowers cost and it lowers prices, and it allows the producers to focus on what they do best. Your strong suit may be in the design of the computer, or the marketing of the computer, or the distribution of the computer, rather than in the manufacture of the chipset. The problem with that, however, is that it leads to loss of control in terms of the quality, and ultimately it could weaken your customer ties. So if you buy components and you don't properly test them and they turn out to be faulty, then it's going to be your black eye, not the computer component manufacturer's black eye. So there are costs and there are benefits associated with outsourcing. And we see this with what most people think of in outsourcing is customer service, and you see these exact same problems with customer service. Why do they outsource customer service? Well, it's cheaper, lower price, allows them to concentrate on what they're actually interested in. What are the problems? Well, people aren't served as well. They're not as satisfied, they're not as happy, and so as a result, when they have problems with their products, then they consider you to be the bad producer, not necessarily the people you contracted with. Now, there are occasions when we end up with what's known as economies of scope. And that is that we actually introduce different items or new product lines because we have an advantage in those areas. That is, it's cheaper to produce the different items within the one firm. An example of this is that GE has made turbine engines, jet engines, for years and years. And they've been very successful in that industry. As we began to investigate alternative energy sources, they began to also make wind turbines. And the reason being that they already had an advantage in that area. Use bigger turbines, but it's basically, you know, if you understand fluid dynamics, you understand fluid dynamics. And the result is that the combination of those two products results in a per unit cost falling. And so the scope of what they're doing with their business is actually increasing instead of decreasing. Now that leads us to the whole idea of how do markets behave in a world in which information is imperfect, when we're not 100% sure what is available in the way of information. Now there is some information that's common and everyone has it and it's freely available. But for most information, it has a marginal cost associated with it. That is, you have to search it out. You have to go look for it and find it. And so the marginal cost curve actually slopes upward. Why would you then go and seek out additional information? Well, the reason you do is because each additional piece of information has a marginal benefit. You either find better quality for the same price or a lower price for the same quality. And so as you acquire more and more information, you get more and more benefit. Unfortunately, however, the marginal benefit decreases, and so we end up with what is the classic model for a market. That is, the marginal cost of information continues to increase, and the marginal benefit continues to decrease, and so ultimately we find ourselves in a position where we have the optimum level of information. Now this will differ depending on what the product is. So if you're considering what new laundry detergent do you want, then the marginal benefit is lower, and so we would shift our marginal benefit curve downward toward the origin, and we'd be less willing to search out information. On the other hand, if we were buying a new car, the marginal benefit of that information would be much higher, since we're going to have to live with that for a longer period of time. And so we would be willing to search out additional information and go through additional searches and new sources and so forth. But for any particular purchase, there is an optimal level of information, here listed as I star. It is not the maximum amount of information, which is listed there as I sub P. It's not the most information that you can get, but you finally get with most products to a point where you say, okay, that's enough, I need to just make a decision and move on. So we're looking for the point where the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. We're not looking for full information, we're looking for optimal information. We will search to a point where we finally can make a distinction between the price differences and the quality differences, and can sort it out and decide what things we want to, what are our choices essentially. Now, it's also the case that there is a thing called the winner's curse, and this happens oftentimes in auctions. The winner of an auction is always the person who ends up with the highest bid. So in some ways, they're the most optimistic. And so since some people have more information in the auction process than others, you're often left with this sinking feeling when you win the auction that maybe they knew something you didn't know. And this is known as the winner's curse. It simply means that by being a winner, after the transaction takes place, you may suddenly wonder, did I really get a good value or not? Maybe I was just the one here who didn't know something that I should have known, and that's known as the winner's curse. Now, one particularly troublesome area within markets is asymmetry of information. Asymmetric information means that in most transactions, one side of the market knows more than the other side of the market does. One side of the market knows more about the product than the other side of the market. And you may be jumping to the conclusion that that's always the seller, but it's not always the seller. It's always the case that either the buyer or the seller knows more about the market than the other one does, or has a specific piece of information that's very useful or very valuable. This leads to hidden characteristics and a phenomenon known as adverse selection. Adverse selection means the informed side of the market self-selects, and the uninformed side of the market takes what's left over. So let's look at what some of the problems are. One problem is known as the principal agent problem. Oftentimes in transactions, you have to hire an agent in order to undertake the transaction. In housing, as an example, they're known as a real estate agent. In legal matters, they're known as a lawyer. And the result is that you're relying on them pursuing your best interest as the principal rather than their best interest as the agent. Typically that's the case, but sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes the real estate agent is interested in making their quota for this year, or sometimes the lawyer has particular agenda that they're looking for. Same thing can happen in any industry. Sometimes they're pursuing some sort of a hidden action which is not in the best interest of you, and you're the principal. In the insurance market, as an example, buyers often have more information than the seller does. You, as the buyer of a health insurance policy, know more about your health than does the seller. Same thing's true about the life insurance or auto insurance or any other sort of insurance, because you have the majority of the information. The adverse selection then means that insurers will tend to be less healthy and will tend to take less care of their health, which is known as moral hazard. Once you're covered by the health insurance, you have no reason at this point to take care of your health because as far as you're concerned, the price has already been paid. And so once again, we have a principal agent problem. This is an example where the buyer has more information and thus is at an advantage. So how do you cope with that asymmetry? Well, you place an incentive structure. That is, there's a great one out now where they lower your deductible the longer you stay with them and stay out of an accident, or they discourage you from doing certain activities such as jumping off on a bungee jump, or you create an information revealing system which is intended to try to recoup some of that information. So as an example, if you get new life insurance or health insurance, they may require tests to see if they can lower some of the asymmetry. In the case of labor markets, there is also an asymmetry and an adverse selection. Employers often offer the going wage, and they are the uninformed side. The candidates, on the other hand, are the informed side. If they're terribly talented, then they don't want the going wage. They want more than the going wage. But if they're less talented, they're satisfied with the going wage because it sounds pretty good to them. So ultimately, employers are better off offering a higher wage, a very efficient wage, and being very quick to make sure that you live up to that wage. In order to get to that, oftentimes they use signaling or screening in an attempt at lowering the asymmetry. Signaling means that they attempt to find a way of communicating valuable information. So when you draw up a resume and you include certain particularly important words on it, or include the degrees that you've earned and so forth, then you're attempting to signal that you are very valuable and that you're capable of doing whatever the higher wage is.